The Battle of New Orleans was a consequential fight. Despite the fact that it was fought after the War of 1812 was over, the Treaty of Ghent had already been signed. This word hadn't reached the Americas that peace had broken out. And effectively, Britain and the United States were still at war. And it definitely didn't stop a gigantic invasion fleet led by Sir Alexander Cochrane, who was bringing a bunch of ships up from Jamaica to seize New Orleans from the Americans. So let's imagine for a second that you're Alexander Cochrane and you're trying to attack New Orleans. How are you going to do it? Well, you could try sailing that big invasion fleet up the Mississippi. Good luck with that, especially in winter. And with Fort St. Philip and a bend in the river, which is pretty sort of well positioned to defend from just such an attack. You could also go overland, attacking Mobile, capturing Mobile, going over to Baton Rouge, capturing that, and then going down the river. But that pretty much ruins the element of surprise. So at that point, there are only two options. You could attack by Lake Pontchartrain, which is pretty shallow, and you can't bring those big ships of the line in there. And so that's really kind of no good. You've got to have your men row the entire way over to the shores of Lake Pontchartrain. So Cochrane decided that he was going to attack by Lake Bourne, which, if you look at a map, seems to make the most sense. The British swept aside some American ships that were there to stop them and landed on the shore of the Wilderness and had to slog through the muck, where several of them died. In fact, some of their Jamaican troops actually froze to death. This was December, even in South Louisiana. It gets really cold down here. So finally they arrived at the Villeray plantation, which was like their first semblance of civilization. And Jacques Villeray, who owned it, he escaped and he ran all the way to the city. And he warned Major General Andrew Jackson, who was the commander of the American forces at that battle. So Andrew Jackson said famously, "They shall not sleep a single night on our soil," and marched to attack. And he took the initiative, which was very, very, smart of him. And he attacked the British in a famous night battle in their camp and gave them a good drubbing. Now, Major General Sir Edward Pakenham arrived on Christmas Day to take control of the British Army. And he was furious with the position that they were in because Andrew Jackson was in a really strong defensive position. And after a while, he had some slaves build a rampart, which used to be on this spot. This is a reconstruction. We're in Chalmette, Louisiana, by the way, on the New Orleans battlefield on a nice rainy day. And he was pretty well positioned to defend against the British coming all the way over there from the tree line. So Pakenham dillied and he dallied and he tried to sort of figure out a way to try and get around Andrew Jackson. But eventually, January rolled around, his men were running out of food, and on January 7th, 1815, he made the fateful decision to attack the next day. Now, he wasn't a complete dum-dum, despite what his brother-in-law, the Duke of Wellington, might have said. He made sure that he sent about 600 men over to the west bank of the river before dawn on January 8th so that they could capture an American battery over there and turn it on the Americans, to enfilade them, to hit them in their flank. But he woke up, dawn broke, and he was ready to attack. And he didn't hear any gunfire coming from across the river. This is a bad sign. Some of his men said, just call it off. Call it off. The Americans are very well ensconced here, even though we outnumber them. We are going to lose a lot more men than we originally planned. But Pakenham said, no, the enemy is here, and I will fight him here. So he advanced. And the British got slaughtered. They had a bunch of ladders that they had built and put together so that they could scale this very rampart, get past the moat that the Rodriguez Canal, which Jackson's men had sort of expanded here. But they never arrived. The regiment that was supposed to bring them just didn't show up. So the British advanced in force, and the Americans opened fire. Now, some of the Americans didn't even aim. They just stuck their rifles over the lip of the rampart with their heads underneath it and fired without even looking, and they really just couldn't miss. The British were coming in such thick ranks. The artillerymen did the bloodiest work on that day. I mean, as you can imagine, these thickly ranked British soldiers, advancing, and they're just a field day. It's like Christmas for these guys. And one thing I think that it's important to note about the British soldiers at the Battle of New Orleans was that these were not the foppish redcoats that we see in Revolutionary War movies going, "Oh, these rustics are so inept."
These rustics are so inept. Nearly takes the honor out of victory. Nearly.
These were veteran soldiers. They were experienced. They were hardened by battles in the Peninsular Campaign against Napoleon. They were incredibly well disciplined, incredibly well trained. And perhaps that even worked against them. I mean, for example, the 93rd Highlander Regiments, one of the most celebrated regiments in Pakenham's force, their officers were killed here in Chalmette, and they had no orders to advance and no orders to retreat. So they just stood there and died. It was absolutely insane. Now, these artillerymen, especially when the British got close, could employ a canister shot, if you know what that is. So basically, canister shot is instead of ramming down a just a big old cannonball inside the muzzle of your piece, you just fill a canister with a bunch of little or smaller cannonballs. Anything metal will do. Forks, knives, anything, and then you just fire that, and the effect is like a gigantic scattergun. Just, and God help the man who's within 30 yards of that. There ain't going to be nothing left of you but a red spot in the mud. So the British were getting slaughtered. Pakenham saw which way the wind was blowing, so he rode out himself to rally his troops. Get back in line, as one does. And he was shot in the arm. His horse was shot out from under him, but being a badass, he just mounted another horse and goes, advance! And then he got hit by canister shot, by grape shot, actually, to be more accurate, right here, right in the side. Now that is a nasty place to get hit by canister shot. And he fell, advance! And his aide, who I believe his name was Duncan MacDougall, so he was a nice Greek boy, dragged him back over to the tree line, and Packenham's last words were, "Tell Lambert," Lambert was the general who was supposed to take over from him, "tell Lambert to continue the advance." And so Duncan MacDougall goes over to General Lambert, I believe he was in the rear of the British lines, and said, "General Lambert, you must continue the advance, it is Sir Edward's final wish." And one of Lambert's aides answered for him, said, "If Sir Edward is killed, then General Lambert will decide the outcome of the day." The thing is, General Lambert panicked, and he ordered a general retreat. He thought that there was no winning here in Chalmette, and he retreated. Now, this was a bad move on General Lambert's part, because those 600 British soldiers who had sailed over to the West Bank, they were significantly delayed. They did not take into account the currents of the Mississippi, which took them about a mile downriver from where they should have been. But they finally landed, and they swept aside the pitiful American force that was there to intercept them. They captured the gun, but when they heard this general retreat, they had to obey that order. Now, those 600 men were in a prime position to bring that gun, or chase those American militia all the way to Algiers Point, which is right across the river from the French quarter. And had they been given maybe a couple more hours, the British could have started shooting holes into, St. Louis Cathedral, into the Plaza d'Armes, and at that point the city would have surrendered. People in New Orleans at that time, which in those days was pretty much just the French quarter, were fully expecting to see redcoats, marching into their city at any day now, down at what I'm sure at the time was the very clean and stately and well-paved Bourbon Street. But it didn't happen. Lambert ordered the retreat, and everybody went back. The whole campaign ended in abject failure for the British. Without his victory here, Andrew Jackson certainly never would have become president. Also, if the British had taken Louisiana, American westward expansion would have been severely hampered. Canada would be the greatest country on earth if the British had won the Battle of New Orleans. But it meant something really significant for the people of New Orleans in particular, because all these people that Andrew Jackson gathered together to fight his battle for him came from all walks of life. In many ways, they were like a microcosm of the different sorts of people who were living in New Orleans at that time. He had American militia from Kentucky and Tennessee. He had French Creoles, Spanish Creoles, regiments of free people of color, actually staffed by black officers. Now, that was really unusual. The 54th Massachusetts, the first black regiment to fight in the American Civil War, did so under white officers. And this was 50 years later, in New England. And they still had to serve under Matthew Broderick. So, and he had Choctaw Indians. He had pirates, famously, under Jean Lafitte, although he was not actually here during the battle. His brother was, or at least the man we think is his brother, Dominic You, or Dominique You, if you want to be French about it. He did great service for the Americans with his accurate artillery, and actually won an artillery duel against the British. And all these people kind of came together for one purpose under one flag for the very first time. And the effects of that really cannot be overstated.